네, 여러분 안녕하십니까? 저는
Hello,
코리아 포럼 EU 세션의 진행을 맡은
I'm the moderator for session two, the second day session. I am Yoon Dok-young, KDI visiting researcher. I'm the honorary chair of USA Korea. This session will focus on the promotion of value-based economic cooperation between Korea and the European countries. We have three presenters for this session,
패널 토론이
and then which will be followed by expert panel discussion.
오늘 다른 학회의 인사들의 그 기조 연설이나 이런 거 없이 바로
Without any keynote speeches, we're going to just move into the presentations right away for this session. So I'm going to introduce to you our speaker. I'm going to step off the stage. First presenter is researcher Kang Na-kyung from the Graduate School for International Studies at Seoul National University. She will talk about issues related to the economic cooperation with Europe in the United States, China hegemony. Second presentation will be delivered by Lee Sung-bong, who is the president of USA Korea. A presentation will focus on characteristics, case examples, and implications of development cooperation with Europe. And the third presentation will be delivered by Professor Tae-hwan Kim, honorary chair of the USA Korea, and also Professor of Myeongji University will talk about economic cooperation based on values between Korea and the European Union. Panel discussions will be introduced to you at a later point. Now, I'm going to invite our presenters to the stage. They'll be given 15 minutes for their talk. And if you could save your time, we would appreciate it very much. So for the first presentation, we're going to invite researcher Na-kyung Kang to the stage. Please welcome the researcher with a round of applause.
네, 안녕하세요. 서울대. Hello everyone, as has been introduced, Kang Na-kyung from SNU. Thank you to the organizers for giving me this opportunity to give a presentation. I am a student studying Europe, and I'm going to be discussing the EU economic integration and external cooperation with the US and the ROK. And I prepared my presentation in English, so I'm going to speak in English. So one of the fascinating things about studying the EU is to observe the impact of trade on its trade partners and multinational corporations to elevate environment and labor standards as well as individual freedom and human rights. This shapes the internal and external economic cooperation of the EU today. Today, I will present the EU's actions amid the US-China competition, highlighting the EU's role as a regulatory state and regulatory power using its significant single European market. So before delving into the EU's norm, what is happening in the global affairs? First, the US-China trade protectionism is continued since the Trump administration in 2018, and the Biden administration also announced a similar protectionism-aimed measures, including CHIPS and Science Act. This aims to protect the US domestic semiconductor technologies that have crucial military and economic importance. And secondly, we are also witnessing energy crisis caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and thus the EU member states government allocated $276 billion to curb the impact of rising energy crisis, energy costs caused by the natural gases and oil prices increases. And this time of challenges in the current global affairs, the EU has been serving as a regulatory superpower with intention and without it. The term Brussels effect describes the phenomenon that diffuses the EU's regulation in multinational corporations and nation states outside the single European market, which are held mainly through trade. This is particularly salient in competition, environment, and data protection policies. This map shows the EU's regulatory power by the de facto externalization of its regulations, and the EU highlights not only the removal of tariffs, but also sustainability. The first new generation FTA was concluded with the ROK, and this made the ROK to promise efforts and commitment to environment and labor standards. Now I will move on to EU's internal economic policies. The von der Leyen Commission has announced new industrial strategy in 2020. This document includes external economic cooperation aspect. The EU's industry is at the center of its growth, and industrial sector takes up 20% of EU's economy, and 80% of this is by the export products, and 90% of them is small and medium-sized enterprises. And the objective of the EU with the new industrial strategy is to lead green and digital transition and the EU's competitiveness and strategic autonomy at this time of moving geopolitical plates. So in highlighting these characteristics of EU's industrial market, von der Leyen announced that it will lead these markets by through reducing bureaucracy and financial support for the digital and green transformation for the small and medium-sized enterprises. So thus, at the center of new industrial strategy, the EU implements green and digital transition in internal market for all EU member states to realize the carbon neutrality by 2050. And as it is also aims to sharpen digital technologies and create an environment for economic actors to decarbonize the European economy and upskill the workers, those skills will become obsolete due to the green and digital transition. So how these three pillars of the new industrial strategy is translated into EU-US economic cooperation? The EU and the US together account for the largest trade volumes in goods and services and takes up 42% of the global GDP, and they are the core guardians of liberal international order. But China overtook the EU's largest import market since 2020, which suggests that the cooperation with China will also play an important role to a certain extent. So the first pillar highlighted in this EU-US-China cooperation is energy security. In this joint statement announced in March 2022, the termination of Europe's dependency on Russian energy by 2027 was declared, and it aims to replace with more stable, affordable, and reliable clean energy supplies. In earlier statement, it also mentioned that two parties will work together for renewable energy efficiency and relevant technologies. Moreover, it will create more stable supply value chain for LNG and natural gases for energy security of Europe temporarily. And second pillar is digital and green transition. As mentioned earlier slide, energy security is an external pressure for the EU to prepare for the green transition. The EU and US established Transatlantic Forum to foster trade and technology related issues based on shared democratic values since last year, and this is called Trade and Technology Council. In the TTC document made in 2022, May this year, Russia was mentioned 56 times in this document. And Russian aggression was not only limited to energy security issues in terms of termination of EU's dependency on Russian gas, but also diverse human rights issues, freedom aspects were discussed. This information inside Russia and the G7 states, and as well as export control, and lastly, secure and trusted resilience ICT importance for security and sovereignty were also discussed. In contrast, China was only mentioned 3 times. It mentions that the US will ban Uyghur forced labor prevention and mentioned that it will ban entry of mined and produced and manufactured goods from Xinjiang. It also stressed the issue of concentration of solar supply channel, mainly by the Chinese government, with 60% of rare earth mining produced in the country. While their target is different, the EU and US still have common grounds and common goals as a guardian of liberal international order. This strengthens their cooperation. It emphasized the democratic value at the heart of trade and technology, and they also aim to develop international standards to curb non-market trade practices to regulate global tech firms, highlighting individual rights and freedoms. Finally, labor rights has been also started to be introduced in bilateral TTC Council. The TTC will help laborers to make successful green and digital transition while remain globally competitive. The first TTC's labor dialogue, they announced measures will be taken to alleviate high inflationary pressure and to foster transatlantic trade and to reduce impact of digital trade on transatlantic workers. So what about the EU-ROK economic cooperation? The bilateral FTA was applied in 2011 and went into force in 2015, and the FTA with the ROK was the first of the kind of new generation FTA, which included trade and sustainable development chapter. Now the South Korea ranks the 9th largest trade partners of the export and import of goods for the EU. In the bilateral FTA, we established 6 specialized committees, and the Committee on Trade and Sustainable Development chapter is created to cover sustainability issues. And in this committee, the EU and the ROK discuss labor's rights, environment, regulations, and monitoring of these through the developing domestic advisory groups and bilateral committees. So using these bilateral committees, the first pillar of the EU-ROK economic cooperation is green transition. In the EU-ROK Joint Committee in June this year, mentions that the bilateral parties' commitment to green and digital and socially inclusive economic strategies in the era of post-COVID-19. Specifically, the EU stresses on the ROKs to participate on relevant international alliance groups, including CACERE, and ways to implement shipment of plastic waste to ensure proper management as an OECD member state. And furthermore, the EU also encourages the ROK government to support CBAM. CBAM is carbon border adjustment mechanism, which will be applied into importing goods into EU market, while the EU ETS will be still applied in parallel. This only targets 5 high-emission industrial sectors to reduce emission, which are electricity, iron, steels, aluminum, and fertilizer, which will be critical to ROK. The EU started to encourage the ROK since April last year to support for the CBAM once it's implemented, but it still has been debated in terms of WTO compatibility, and also contestation inside and outside the EU is still happening. And in the second pillar, we can see the digital transition. Both countries cooperate in terms of the e-commerce for digital trade. And for bilateral digital trade, the EU-ROK discussed the ROK's plan to be part of the large scheme of GDPR. GDPR is the EU's data protection law for a single European market, and it will be applied to EU citizens' data used or transferred overseas. When the European citizens' data is handled, now the Korean companies need to handle following the EU laws. The last pillar concerns labor rights, and in the bilateral trade, both parties discuss compliance related to ratification of the Convention of 105, which is abolition of forced labor, and this will be the last fundamental convention of the ILO that the ROK should ratify to comply with the EU-ROK Trade and Sustainable Development chapter. So I presented the issue related to the EU regulatory power in green and digital transition in the EU-US relations and with the ROK. And the EU-US economic cooperation highlights liberal international order in digital and economic transition. This was emphasized in the concerns related to disinformation about Russia invasion of Ukraine in the TTC-related documents. And the EU will further strengthen the EU-US alliance, and some professor in Brussels casually mentioned that the TTC is currently largely developed by the EU actors, not the US actors. This is also reflected in the frequency of mentioning Russia being 17 times more than that of China. This suggests that the EU will continue to utilize current momentum to create international standards to lead green digital transition. Secondly, however, we see this transition in green field will require more time and may not go as it planned. The EU's ambition to lead green transition is strong, but the feasibility is another issue. The ordinary legislative procedure inside the EU has not been yet ended due to diverging stances between the Council and the European Parliament in the issue of the use of the carbon border adjustment mechanism's revenue. And it also has remaining issues concerning the WTO compatibility remains in the same aspect. Thus, the green transition would require more time to be addressed, and it will be a huge challenge for the EU in green field. So this has been all from me, and thank you so much for listening.
네, 강나경 연구원님.
Thank you very much, Nagyang
EU의
강.
그린 트랜지션 그리고 디지털 트랜지션과 관련해서
So it was about green transition and digital transition in EU and EU's role as a regulatory entity and how EU is cooperating with Korea in all these relevant areas. So this was a very important presentation, and later we're going to be able to discuss the content of the presentation during the panel discussion.
해보도록 하겠습니다. 이제 두 번째 발제
Moving on to the second presentation.
하겠습니다. 앞에서 말씀드린 바와 같이
As I briefly mentioned, this is going to be delivered by Mr. Sung-bong Lee, who is the president of USA Korea.
나오셔서 유럽의
A
개발
professor of Seoul Women's University will talk about Europe's development cooperation strategy, the features, case examples, and implications. Please welcome the speaker with a round of applause.
예, 반갑습니다. 방금 소개받은 한국의학회
Thank you very much. I represent the USA Korea also and working as a professor of business administration at Seoul Women's University. I am Lee Sung-bong. Nice to meet you all.
제가 두 번째 발제가 되겠는데요.
So I'm going to begin my presentation as a second speaker.
이제 그 개발 협력
I will talk about international development cooperation of Europe, the strategy, characteristics, examples, as well as implications for Korea.
내용을 중점적으로 다루겠습니다.
So I'll be mainly dealing with three parts. First, EU's international development cooperation policy will be addressed. Second part deals with the recent issues and case examples of the EU's international development. Third, possible EU-ROK partnership for international development cooperation. I will suggest some recommendations.
국제개발 협력
First, Europe's international development cooperation policy.
개요 측면하고 EU
Introduction, and at the EU level, EU institutes, and some of the key
독일
countries in terms of cooperation: Germany, UK, France, and Sweden,
EU는
in that order specified. First of all,
전체적인 어떤 그
at a EU-wide level, the international development cooperation size is $165 billion.
이게 이제 국가별로 보면은
And by country,
저머니가 가장
Germany
큰
is the biggest aid donor in Europe.
이제 1,520억 달러
It's about $152 billion, which is about 10 times bigger than that of Korea.
그 전반적으로 이제 EU 차원에서
Across the board, from the EU level, there are three important EU institutions that are involved in development cooperation policy, which is European Commission, EIB, which is Investment Bank, and European External Action Service.
기관에서 이제 하고 있다 이렇게 볼 수 있겠고요. EU 차원의 개발 협력과 관련된 그
In terms of EU's international development cooperation,
주요 그 문서들은 한 네 가지 정도
as for main issues and documents, there are four things that I want to mention. First is European consensus on development, policy coherence for development, and third is development effectiveness.
그 아프리카
Fourth is African, Caribbean, and Pacific countries, the partnership with EU. That's ACP-EU partnership.
이제 그 컨센서스 온 디벨롭먼트는 이제
So
2017년에
European consensus on development was updated in 2017. The main goal is to eradicate
완전한 그런
poverty completely
지속 가능 개발에 대한
and achieve sustainable development.
그런 목적이 되겠고요. UN의 SDG
UN SDG
그 5P를 또 그대로
and also 5Ps
전략들을
are to be implemented at a EU-wide level.
그리고 이제 두 번째는 이제 폴리시
Second
연계 부분과 관련해서
is related to policy coherence for international development.
어떻게
There are different levels of cooperation in EU. How can synergies be created from different policies? and specific partnership programs are being operated.
개발 효과성과 관련해서
Third, in relation to the effectiveness of development,
지금 내용들을 담고 있는데요.
we have very important areas that are being addressed at the EU level. The third line here from the top,
뭐 원조 그 사업들 개발협력 사업
various programs. The goals are to be defined clearly.
여기 보시면 이제 policy process
These are the bullet points over here. And for the policy process,
과정들이죠. 이런 부분들을 이제
so to be supported.
세 번째 보시면 이제 그
And third bullet here
국가들의 자체적인 시스템을
is for partner countries to establish their own systems.
것으로 그 원조의 효과성을 보는 게 아니고
We're not looking at the effectiveness of development by just being involved in one specific project, but actually more important is to focus on the systems,
이제 가버넌스로
which is translated into governance for Europe. So the local countries, the partner countries,
가버넌스 체계를
how can they build a strong governance system so that they can become the main principal
지속 가능할 수 있다.
entities for development?
보겠다.
That is how they want to assess the effectiveness of development, and that commitment by the EU has been expressed.
보시면은
Fourth bullet point here is
버짓 서포트 같이 예산의 지원이나 이런 걸 통해서 실질적인
using budget support,
내용들을
providing actual financial support, and doing it in an effective manner. So these are four principles for assessing the effectiveness of development. I think this is a very desirable approach.
아프리카 지역하고 캐리비안
And Africa, Caribbean, and Pacific, the countries in these regions, EU is also pushing ahead with economic cooperation in earnest.
개발 협력에 아까 말씀드렸던 이제 1,650억 달러 정도
Out of $165 billion,
어떤 분야인
where is that going to? So in terms of distribution, across the EU level,
되게 이제
of course, they're mostly going to the eastern bloc of Europe
동유럽의 이제 남쪽이죠. 예.
and also the south of Europe.
아프리카의 이제 그 아프리카 지역이라고 볼 수 있겠는데 이런
And they're bordering African countries. So there's a huge concentration of the funding going into these regions. And mostly they're going to the economic infrastructure building and also social infrastructure instead of social infrastructure or service.
OECD 닥에서
The graph shows at the OECD DAC
빼면 다섯 가지인데요.
others, their social infrastructure, economic infrastructures, production, multi-sector, humanitarian assistance. So there are 5 sectoral
EU 차원에서는
aiding done,
소셜 인프라스트럭처
and the EU focuses on social infrastructure services and economic infrastructures.
부분으로 되어 있다 이렇게 볼 수 있습니다.
So these two sectors are the most important areas of ODA for the EU. By each member country, social infrastructure and services is actually the biggest portion of the funding. And the EU actually has a stronger focus on economic infrastructure at a higher level. So let's look at specific countries first, starting with Germany. It's the second largest development cooperation provider among the OECD DAC,
그런 국가고요. GNI의 0.74%
0.74% of GNI. That's the contribution that it is making in terms of ODA. So what is this strategy? It's implementing a strategy called BMZ 2030. It's Bundesministerium Zusammenarbeit,
이제 그
which is
있죠. 보시면 BMZ
you have the agency at the bottom. That's the Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, BMZ.
연방
That's one of the ministries under the federal government that's responsible for economic cooperation and development. It could be, for example, the Ministry of Economy and Finance or the Ministry of Trade, Industry, and Energy. Then you have this other line ministry.
이 국제개발 협력에 대해서
So the German government really has a strong policy, a momentum at a federal level for development cooperation. And in terms of the budget and also the scale, it is befitting its commitment level in terms of development cooperation projects.
보면은 주로 이제 그 아시아 지역하고
By region, most of it going to Asia and the Middle East.
아까 제가 말씀드렸듯이
And also in terms of sectors, social infrastructure and services, that's taking up the most in terms of the commitments.
영국은 이제 EU 회원국은
And next is the UK. It's not a member of the EU anymore, but nonetheless, it is an important country in terms of development cooperation. So we'll just take a look at the country very briefly. Main strategy
투자 부분을 이제 많이 해주는 그런 거.
is scaling up its investment, focusing on gender equality, humanitarian assistance, climate change, and so forth. There are 4 different areas of strategic importance for the UK. And FCDO, which is Government Ministry, Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office that is responsible for ODA. And again, Africa and Asia and the Middle East are the priority countries for ODA. And projects are mostly centering on social infrastructure and services, public policies.
많이 하고 있다 이렇게 볼 수 있겠습니다. 프랑스의 경우는
Next, France,
GNI의 한 0.52%
0.52% of GNI ODA has been committed.
10가지
Key strategies
가지고 있습니다.
are addressing 10 priority fields.
모든 그런 그
There are
ODA 분야들을 총괄하고
actually encompassing
그리고 여기는
a
이제
full spectrum
외교
of areas for ODA. So the Ministry of Foreign Affairs
개발
and the agency for the development, which is AFD. These 2 organizations are implementing the relevant policies.
지역은 역시 이제 그
By geography, again,
주로 이제 그 아프리카 지역
funding is mostly going to the African region and Asia.
분야는 이제 소셜 역시 소셜 인프라스트럭처
By sector, social infrastructure and services. That takes up the lion's share
스웨덴
of the commitments. Sweden is also doing very well. 0.92% of GNI for ODA commitment. That's really high compared to others. They focus on poverty reduction and especially helping the sub-Saharan African countries, cooperation, and
포린 폴리시와
the
연계된
representative feature of Sweden is that it's very much related to women, gender equality, based on its feminist foreign policy.
정부의 이제 그
So there are about 4 or 5 pillars in its strategy. First, poor people. Second, rights. Third, environment and climate. 4, gender equality. And number 5 is conflict.
시다라고 아주
And there's an agency called SIDA, Swedish International Development Agency, that's responsible for development cooperation.
이제 그
This is by geography, mostly going to Asia and Africa.
평화, 젠더 이슈
Peace, gender issues, partnership, poverty, health
대해서 이제 집중적으로
are the focus areas of project implementation.
그 페미니스트 포린 폴리시
And feminist foreign policy, as I mentioned before,
이슈들을 집중적으로 그래서 이제
is basically dealing with 4 important issues here. 4 R's, reality.
여성의 그 어떤 어떤 실제적인 데이터 부분에서 어떤
In terms of the actual data and statistics, do we have any differences between men and women? Second is right.
권리 부분에 대해서 얘기를 하고 있고
Are we ensuring the rights
이제 그 대변
properly? And number 3 is representation of women. And number 4, resources. How are they being allocated?
단계적으로
So they're very specific and gradual, step-by-step manner in the execution of policy. You can just refer to this information.
페미니스트 폴리시 포린
Swedish foreign policy, feminist foreign policy, is directly linked to the development cooperation policy of the country. Next,
한 6가지 정도
I will address 6 case studies. First is at an EU level, and 2 Germany,
간략하게 한번
and 1 UK, and also France. First is Eurosocial.
이제 그 중남미 국가들
That's a project funded by the European Union and implemented by a consortium of Latin American countries.
출발했다가
First, it began as a Eurosocial, but in 2016 it was upgraded.
소셜
It became Eurosocial Plus.
주요 내용들은 보면은 이제
Here's a major content. Many issues on women are dealt, physical empowerment, economic empowerment, and political empowerment of women, and mainstreaming the gender perspectives.
네 가지 정도의
There
퍼블릭 폴리시
are 4 themes
부분에 있어서 이 사업은
in public policy.
중남미 국가들과 함께
So it's all about empowerment and working closely with countries in the Latin American region.
사회탄에 독일에서 하고 있는 게
And another example is from Germany is Make It Africa, Make IT. That's IT related project for economic cooperation and assistance, providing some support for startups as well. That's done with Africa. That continues from the previous page.
독일이 또 하고
And
있는
also Germany is doing this very well in terms of vocational training,
그
education.
아시아, 중앙아시아 국가들을 상대로
For countries in Central Asia, they provide support for Tibet.
캐리비안 국가
And next is what the UK is doing for the Caribbean countries, for the young people, especially in vulnerable situations.
그 다음에 이제 그 영국이 또 인도네시아에서 그
And also in Indonesia, there is a project for strengthening palm oil sustainability. And France is conducting this project for hydropower generation in Pakistan.
유학원의 파트너십과 관련해서
So let's take a look at possible partnership between the EU and ROK for international development cooperation. I will give you 4 suggestions by different sector. As I mentioned before, just like the EU level, we allocate a lot of funding for social infrastructure and services.
저게 이제
And as for Japan,
이코노믹 인프라스트럭처 쪽이
they're very much leaning towards economic infrastructure, which is far bigger than the size for social infrastructure and services.
이런 상황이라고 볼 수 있는데
But even compared to European countries, our share is really high for social infra. But value-centric economic cooperation
사실 이제 우리가 가치 중심이라고
can be promoted
한국이 지금 어떤
because
가치의 국제적인 연대
we're trying to develop international solidarity for value-based cooperation. There are also many recipient beneficiary countries
개발이나 여러 가지 사회 개발을
who
그
need to
그리고 현지에
build their capacity to do their economic and social infrastructure building.
창조적으로 만들어내고 자기 나라에 맞는 그리고
So they have to actually make policies that are custom tailored to their own needs and have the right capacity and right skill sets. So when we're conducting our project, we have to do the assessment of the current situations of the beneficiaries at the same time. So in terms of development effectiveness, the 4 principles were put forward by the EU. Along the same line, we can work with the EU and to look at the results of the project and to find a way to improve the effectiveness of development, especially from the point of view, from the perspective of governance.
아까 제가 이제 계획에서도
Second,
말씀을 드렸었는데
I mentioned this during the opening ceremony in the morning, in the morning, that we have the framework agreement and free trade agreement and also crisis management agreement. First framework agreement is related to political area. Second, for economic area. Third is related to security. So Korea is the only country in Asia that has signed these 3 major agreements with the EU. So we have to tap into this. And also at a regional level, Asia, Africa, and the Pacific are the common areas of interest for our 2 sides. So we can we can be engaged in relevant projects in this regard. And also a policy consultation meeting is underway between the 2 sides, and we can strengthen that. And on that note, I would like to conclude my presentation. I'm sorry for taking up a lot of time. Thank you very much.
네, 이성봉 교수님.
Dr. Lee, thank you. That was Europe's development cooperation strategy, characteristics, case examples, and implications. And in terms of the ODA policy,
선두주자들인 유럽
European countries are the leaders.
어떤 정책을 하는지 자세히
And he gave us a very detailed explanation of each country's strategy and some room for cooperation with Korea.
편을 들을 때 다시
Again, we will deal with some of the specifics at a panel discussion. Thank you.
Let's move on to the third presentation, which will be provided by Professor Kim Tae-hwang of Myeongju University, Department of International Business and Trade. And he's also a former president of our USA, Korea. And he's going to be discussing promoting the economic cooperation between Korea and the European countries. So please welcome Professor Kim with a big round of applause.
예, 안녕하세요. 김태왕입니다.
Good afternoon. As has been introduced, my name is Kim Tae-hwang, and in my presentation, I would like to talk about the direction of Korea's trade policies.
디커플링 또는 리
There's decoupling and recoupling taking place, and we're at a crossroad between the U.S. and China. There's intensifying competition over hegemony, and the two countries have no intention of giving up on this competition. So, in this context, what are the breakthroughs? What are the directions Korea has to take? And what is EU doing, and why are they doing it that way? So in conclusion, there is strategic competition between the US and China, and Korea can become closer to the EU to address some of the pending challenges. For the past 70 years, the European Union has been successful in achieving economic and social integration, and its role of the EU has been prominent. But recently, it is quite interesting that the EU's influence and role in the global community has been weakened. So I would like to shed light on this topic. In the past, Korea achieved quantitative growth in terms of trade volume. We thought only about how to increase export volume, how to sign more FTAs with countries, but such strategy has been met with limitations. So we need to make a paradigm shift. And in doing so, we need to devise trade policies and economic policies based on norms and value. That's my basic idea. I am conducting research right now, so the final outcome has not been produced, but I am thinking about these questions. So this is what I have in mind.
뚜렷한 일
Now the US and China are competing fiercely, and in December 2020, despite the opposition of the US, the EU signed an agreement with China, and then because of the human rights issues, there was a conflict between the EU and China, and in May, the European Parliament decided to suspend the voting on this free trade agreement, and it didn't go through very well.
미중 갈등 또 EU
So there is growing conflict between the US and China, and also related tensions with the EU. And what can Korea do in terms of its policy, its trade policy? What are our national interests? What are the core values we need to maintain? And how can we cooperate with European countries? In what framework and in what medium can we promote such cooperation? So the previous two presentations talked about development cooperation. In the past, we were mainly involved in bilateral development cooperation or development cooperation through MDBs. But now, we can cooperate with EU countries to provide development assistance. So this is a way forward. This is an alternative option. So we can go beyond the limits of the Korea-EU FTA, and we can not only promote quantitative growth, but also qualitative growth by promoting value-based FTA. So that's the key essence of my presentation. Let's take a look at this graph. Since 2001, you may think that the average is quite low, but because of the financial crisis, there was a dip, and also because of the pandemic, there was another disruption. But for the past 2 decades, overall, you can see that there has been more than 10% growth in trade volume between Korea and the EU.
FTA가 잠정 발효
And there was a temporary entry into force,
한국이 EU에 대한
and since 2012,
흑자에서
trade balance of Korea has turned to a deficit. But nevertheless, the trend has been that our trade and our investments have been growing consistently.
FDI를 보면요.
When you take a look at the FDI flow on the left-hand side, this is FDI of Europe to Korea, and right-hand side, you can see FDI inflows. Well, let me check again. Okay, that's quite the other way around. So on the left-hand side, it is FDI of Korea to the EU, and on the right-hand side, it is FDI of Korea from Europe. So after 2016 and 17, there's an increasing trend, and you can see a very steep increase on the left-hand side. This means that Korean companies are making active investments in the EU, and this may have a partial effect of the Korean EU FTA. There's no causal relationship that has been proven, but this may be the impact. And for 10 years, there has been significant increase in trade and investment between the two parties in terms of trade in goods and services as well as investments. So Korea's trade increase in goods was only 0.8% for the world as a whole, but the trade in goods of Korea increased by 1.9% annually for Europe. And also, while the world average is 1.4% increase, Korea's service exports to the EU increased by 4.1%, which is a high growth rate. So, both in terms of trade of services and goods, we have seen great increase. And now it is time for Korea to expand and deepen bilateral cooperation with EU in terms of green issues and Green Deal and digital transformation issues. I believe that there is potential, a lot of potential for Korea and EU to work together so that we can respond to this recent trend of restructuring of supply chains.
글로벌 이슈들 가운데 한국이
There are
직면
many global issues, and as for Korea,
신보호 무역주의
there is growing protectionism and my nation first policy and strategy of many countries have become a new normal, which is causing much impact. And the WTO was created and globalization took effect, but since 1995, FTAs increased dramatically and regionalism gained power. So, not only with the development of ICT, but also expansion of liberalism and increasing exchanges, there was a higher level of globalization, but nevertheless, because of the competition between the US and China, protectionism has become a new normal. So this is a recent trend globally. So how can Korea respond to this trend? There are efforts for restructuring of supply chains. In what directions such reshuffling will take place? What should be the role of Korea? And how can Korea adapt to these changes? And how can Korea contribute to these changes? Should we just follow these trends, or should we take initiative in developing our own position? So there are a lot of concerns and questions. And of course, we need to pursue economic alliance, and we need to go beyond that, because there are initiatives for multilateral cooperation pursued by China. So there are a lot of thoughts, a lot of issues that we need to deal with. In the past, our trade dependence on China is more than 25%, and we need a third option. And there are opportunistic costs and also other costs involved. And when you try to recreate a value chain, there will be increase in transaction costs. So in the middle of that, Korea is in a very tricky situation.
공급망 재편에서의 한국
Therefore, in the context of restructuring of value chains, we need to consider the cost side, but also we need to think about the stability aspect and how can we guarantee our national security, how can we promote our economic security. So there are a lot of issues we need to deal with. As I mentioned before, there are global mega trends which we need to take into account, including environment, human rights, and economic security issues and energy issues. So all of these issues are critical. And then
경쟁 체제에서
Korea, in the middle of global competition, as a nation, as a strong trade nation, can we have some sort of autonomy? Can we have some independence? Can we have a voice? How can we benchmark other countries' experiences? In the past, we had strategic ambiguity. Should we maintain that stance, or should we try to walk a very tight rope? So this is a very difficult balancing act. In February, the EU had announced a new strategy, and they didn't mention value-driven, but EU has expressed its value focus, talking about flexibility and resilience and competitiveness. The EU is now emphasizing the rules-based cooperation, talking about sustainability and just transition. So now, based on this open strategic autonomy, we need to think about the 4 specific aspects of EU towards China. These are paradigm in the report. So in areas where their interests are aligned, they will consider China as a cooperation partner and negotiation partner. But in some of the areas where their interests conflict, then they may be competing. Or in some of the other areas, they can consider China as a cooperation partner. But when it comes to paradigm and governance, they are rivals. So based on these stances, EU has been responding to China. But now there's a lot of tension between the US and China in 3 areas: high-tech, social value issue, and digital trade issue. So in these 3 areas, the US and China are competing and confronting with each other. And as I mentioned earlier, the EU has seen some major changes in its position, as is seen in the trade agreement with China. And in September last year, as Professor Kang mentioned, there is a TTC signed between the US and EU. So TTC is about reviewing investments related to China about semiconductors, and they want to prevent export of semiconductor products to China. And the EU and the US want to cooperate in these areas, and they want to check the progress. On the left-hand side, you can see this amazing thing that's happening in the EU. For the past 1.5 years, we have all these announcements by the EU, and including CBAM. And in July, there was a speech by the head of the EC, and this year or next year, more specific content will be announced. So they are going to make RMA, which is similar to IRA of the US, and CBAM as well. So they are planning to take these measures, and there are 3 common characteristics. First of all, the EU is following what the US is doing, and secondly, they want to strengthen alliance with the US. And third, as you can see on the right-hand side, the second bullet point, they want to be part of TTC, Quad, AUKUS, and Indo-Pacific strategy. So all these economic alliances are all connected. So EU, in its trade policy, is not a singular policy, but it is a very multifaceted and multidimensional policy, and these are all based on value. So Korea-EU FTA has to be strengthened. We didn't have the trade committee, and we didn't have the implementation committee. We only had 3 meetings, and then they were not continued. So we need to revitalize these committees, and CBAM and supply chain guidelines and RMA. All these issues need to be addressed within the framework of the FTA. This is my suggestion. So we may pursue post-FTA arrangement, and also we can have strategic autonomy between Korea and the EU, and there are these key elements. So we like to focus on cutting-edge industrial technology by having a specific target. And I think that we need to work on digital trade and investment. And on the right-hand side, you can see multilateral or plurilateral global cooperation network with a number of countries. And at the bottom, you can see these 2 core elements. Social value-based trade, including peace, security, human rights, economic freedom, democracy, and environment. So these are trade based on social value. And that is a very important issue. This has to do with economic and social security cooperation. And that's the kind of model I envisioned. So in conclusion, we need to upgrade economic cooperation with the European countries. In the current administration, they are promoting a regional cooperation network that prospers together, and we can implement this vision with the EU. And we need to strengthen Korea-EU economic cooperation partnership based on core values. So this means that it's not just siding with one side over the other in the strategic competition between the US and China, but rather just focus on values.
파트너십을
And we need to expand our security partnership, not just to rely on the US, but also expand our security alliance and cooperation with the EU as well. And also,
사업의 프로젝트
European Union and Korea can promote international development cooperation jointly by combining our own forces. And I hope that we can discuss this issue during the panel discussion in more detail. Thank you for your attention.
네, 김태원 교수님 감사드립니다.
Thank you very much. Professor Kim, your passionate presentation, I was inspired by that.
글로벌 이코노미가 사실상
These days, the global economy
간의
is changing.
갈등에서 이제는 이제 진영화
So there was a conflict around trade, but we're now seeing a creation of camps. So it is really driven by value,
얼라이언스
whether countries can really work together within the framework of an alliance.
를 다시 재편하고 있는
So
것으로
we're now seeing the reshuffling of the global world order, a global order in that regards.
트랜지션 그리고
So we're here to talk about green transition as well as digital transition.
EU
So future-oriented cooperation between Korea and the EU, that was the first topic. And second,
EU와
as a leader in international development cooperation, we saw possibilities for furthering cooperation between the two sides.
발제에서는
And the third topic
중심으로 봤을 때
was related to value-based cooperation. How can Korea and the EU can strengthen their economic cooperation, focusing on value?
내용들을 또 발제자들이 발제하신 내용뿐만 아니라 다른 전문가들을 통해서도
So we could get more insight from other experts, not only from the speakers. So we have three panelists who will take the floor.
첫 번째 최희율 경기대
And Choi Hee-yul, professor of economics at Gyeonggi University, he's also the vice president.
한국외대
And second professor is Mr. Kim Seung-yeon from Hufs, also an expert on ODA.
김은경 경기연구원
And Dr. Kim Eun-kyung, senior researcher at Gyeonggi Research Institute, also known as an authority on the EU studies. So we are going to invite our panelists all up on the stage as well as our three presenters. Panelists will be given 7 to 8 minutes for making comments, and the presenters will be given a chance to respond to the comments to be made by the panelists. You can respond, you can give your answers, as well as give further clarification. So we would like to invite you all to the stage.
네, 앞에서 말씀드린 바와 같이
As I mentioned before, we have three presenters and three panelists over here. So Professor Choi Hee-yul,
각 발제에 대해서 토론을 해주시고
you're
저희들이
asked to give comments for each of the speakers, and then we'll give a chance to the speaker to respond. And if we have any time left, then we'll try to get some questions from the audience. Dr. Choi.
들리시죠? 네, 들리는 거죠 이게 안 들려도. 네.
네, 잘 들립니다.
Yes, can you hear me? Nice to meet all of you. I am Choi Hee-yul, professor at Gyeonggi University.
얼마 전에
Recently,
토론을
I was asked to participate as a discussant in the session, and I asked what the session is about, and
한EU 협력인데
I was told that it is about cooperation between Korea and the EU based on value.
가치 중심이라서 가치가 뭔가를
So I thought about what value really represents, and in terms of cooperation between Korea and the EU, I thought about some of the issues.
밸류라는 게 있겠죠.
Of course, value, we can talk about core values such as human rights, freedom, democracy, and so forth.
밸류 밑에 약간
So under the core values, in order to make that possible, we have the tools or instruments. Economic values,
개방된 그런 시장,
an open market, keeping an open market to promote welfare, well-being,
경제적 소외,
and to prevent any economic exclusion, creating an ecosystem towards that end. and financial stability because it leads to collapse across the board. We all know that from our experience.
그러한 경제적 가치
So in that regards,
이라는 게 굉장히
that economic value would be very
요새 최근에
important.
여긴 어떤
Now, if you look at the global trends in the economy,
변화들이 일어나고
I think we're seeing a lot of changes that are threatening such values. For example, the trade conflict between the United States and China, also trade protectionism,
강조해왔던
which have been
경제의 부생 증진 효과를
which are actually undermining the market economics as well as promotion of welfare in the market. And digital transformation, if we do it the right way, we can overcome the issue of economic exclusion, but if it's not done correctly, then it could actually deepen or aggravate economic exclusion.
그다음 또 하나 이 자국 중심의 그런 거시경제 운용
And nationalist approach towards macroeconomic management, for example, what we see in the United States, creating this financial cycle based on its national interest, exerting influence over other countries, and that's leading to instabilities in various markets around the world, leading to financial vulnerabilities, volatilities. So against this backdrop, Korea and the EU could work together to maybe find a way to bring some improvements to the current landscape. So 3 economic values that I've spoken so far, what can the EU and Korea do together?
간략하게 말씀을 좀 드릴게요.
And I've given some thoughts to this, and let me share that with you. First of all, to create an open market environment, I think there's a lot that can be done between the two sides for cooperation. Now, Professor Kim said, what can the EU do in terms of the Sino-US competition? But I think the European Union is also strengthening its alliance partnership with the United States, especially looking at the chart that was shown over the last 2 years. It really has no choice but to lean towards the United States.
개방된 시장에 대한 가치 이런 것
So it's a value for an open market.
무역주의로 지금 움직이고 있는 것에
And as there is a strong push towards trade protectionism, the EU is not at fault
우리가 그런
in that
가치를
regards.
중요시할 수밖에 없는
And of course, we're in a position where we have to put a lot of focus on such value. So we should find a way to step up our cooperation with the EU, maybe at a G20 level or at an ASEM level.
G20는
The G20,
뭐 대단한 걸 이룰 수 있다라고까지는 생각을 안.
I don't think we can really achieve so much from the G20, but it was held in Bali recently.
WTO의
That
해결제도를
the dispute resolution mechanism of the WTO is to be restored. That was one of the conclusions that came out of the summit.
여러 가지 이제
Then the host country, of course, as a president, puts forward a lot of agendas for discussion. But for a country like Indonesia,
이런 미중 통상 문제 때문에
because of the competition between the United States and China,
교란 때문에
and because of disruptions in the global supply chains,
있고
there is a number of countries that are suffering as a result.
생각이 들고
And I think this is a result of trying to improve the situation. So going forward, the G20, I think for those countries in the middle ground, like India or South Africa and Brazil, will be taking the chair, will be taking the presidency going forward. And Korea and the EU can work together to enhance the free market values.
그런 것이 나온 거죠.
As we saw
사실 이렇게 좀
that being possible in Indonesia, we can take small yet meaningful steps forward.
그다음 이제 아셈인데요.
And next is ASEM. It's comprising 53 member states.
정말 구체적인
It's very difficult to do anything very concrete. Even more difficult than a G20. It's the leaders coming together, just have nice meals and have some chats and finish the meeting with no results. But still, the president of ASEM
아셈이 그동안 열심히
can take the initiative. And there are 13 ASEM summits so far. they've always talked about growth and prosperity. That was a key agenda for the meetings. So perhaps through the ASEM architecture, we can enhance the values, and at the same time, from a pragmatic point of view,
공급망 교란에 의해서
because of the supply chain disruptions,
파트너들을
we're trying to find new partners, and we can do that through the ASEM,
할 수가 있지 않을까.
in my view.
두 번째는 이제
Second,
디지털 인클루전 그다음에
digital inclusion and financial inclusion.
한EU 간의 협력이 가능하다. 뭐 조금
There's much to cooperate between the two sides.
보실 때
Yes, researcher Kang mentioned in her presentation that EU is a regulatory superpower, but especially in terms of digitization, there are a lot of standards and regulations that have been presented. For example, GDPR,
DAS 이거는 이제
EIDAS, which is Digital Online Identification System,
미카
and MiCA, virtual currency,
관련된 서비스에 대한
and AI-related service regulation. That hasn't been put into an institutional framework, but there's a lot going on.
많이 활발하게
So the EU is very active in that regards.
이제 이런 디지털 관련해서
And Korea, in terms of digitization, has built up a lot of success stories.
한국하고 EU가
So I think we're quite complementary partners for each other.
합쳐서
And we can marry them well
수 있겠다는
and take that as an agenda for development cooperation. Last but not least,
우리나라와 EU 보다 정확
Korea and the EU, to be more specific or to be more accurate, ASEAN plus 3 and the EU, we can cooperate for financial stability.
생각을 해봤습니다.
And
EU에는 지금 금융안정망으로서
EU, as the financial stability network, they put in place what's called ESM in 2012, comprising 19 European countries,
법인
was funded, and it has been incorporated
위기에
as a body, and they provide funding to those countries in crisis. Most of the funding comes from the issuance of bonds.
동아시아는 뭐 이제
But East Asia, we have CMIM,
지역금융
CMI multilateralization, which is a regional financial safety net.
제대로 된
But East Asia doesn't have an incorporated mechanism, and there's no contribution or commitment coming in. We're just making that commitment or pledges rather than actually putting the contributions.
이제 ESM은
So CMIM is not really functioning as intended, but ESI, the European mechanism, has worked very effectively. Of course, the status may be different between the two mechanisms, but in conducting our cooperation initiatives, I think we can strengthen our joint work in that regards.
전반적인
And Korea and the EU, I believe, not only in terms of technical cooperation, but in terms of financial contribution, we can work together very closely to bring higher level of stability to the financial market across the board, and also to the third countries or third regions. We can transfer our knowledge to these countries, which will go a long way towards improving financial stability. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Che.
다음은 김승연 교수.
Next, I'm going to invite Professor Kim Seung-yeon. We don't have much time, so please limit your remarks to 7 minutes.
예, 한국외대 김승.
Hello, as it has been introduced, I'm Kim Seung-yeon at HUBS.
논문에 대해서 하나씩
I would like to comment on the 3 presentations.
첫 번째 강나경 연구원
First of all, there was a presentation by Dr. Kang Na-kyung, and in her presentation, he mentioned the future agenda items that have been led by the EU, and also some of the research findings related to regulations. And I could see that her research has been focusing on these topics.
그린 트랜지션
And also, I'd like to comment on the issue of green transition. Europe has been a leader in green transition and environmental
그래서
programs. So recently, carbon border adjusted mechanism. So of course there is an issue about the practicality and whether it can be implemented, but the way forward has been presented by Europe. And we all know that Europe is very conscious of environmental issues, including climate change. And so the EU is a leader in formulating and advancing our discourse on environment. So in this area, Korea can cooperate with the EU, but it's not just that we are leading the discussion with the EU, but we are following what the EU has been proposing and leading. So how can we
그린 트랜지션에 대한
become a part of this?
게 가지 않을까 이런 생각이 듭니다.
I believe that the current direction of green transition has been suggested by the EU is going to be the direction, but we need to estimate the speed and cooperate with Europe so that we can be prepared to go into this direction of green transition, which in the way can provide opportunities for Korea. But it's not just something that the government can do alone, but it takes cooperation between the government and the private sector. In particular, I would like to argue that the government has to provide a more consistent policy stance.
14년 전 2008년도에
In 2008, Korea promoted global green growth, and at that time, Korea was recognized as a leader in promoting green growth.
전 세계적인 그때 환경과
And at that time, our agenda was very much in line with the global agenda, but with the change of government, green growth was not sustained. So it is rather unfortunate. So I hope that there will be more consistency in our environmental policies. At that time, the Global Green Growth Institute, or the GGGI, was established in Korea. It is an international organization, and also the Green Climate Fund, or GCF, was created in 2013, and its headquarters are in Incheon.
한국이 이러한
So at that time, Korea gained a lot of recognition as a leader in leading discussions, global discussions on the environment and green growth, but such momentum was lost. Unfortunately, I hope that the Korean government will maintain consistency in its green policies. The next area is economic or development cooperation. Development cooperation is mainly with developing countries, but we can engage the European Union in providing development assistance. And as was mentioned, we need to think about the efficacy and the effect of aid.
큰 규모로 하고
We have been providing a large amount of ODA, and we have to make sure that such ODA is beneficial and helpful. And to do so, we need to think about and revisit and consider our ODA policy. We don't have to do everything. We have to think about our comparative advantage, which is a term used in economics. So we need to see in which areas we have advantage or competitiveness. And
30년이 넘은
I would say that it's been more than 30 years since Korea became a donor country, and we need to reflect on whether we were able to grow our ODA capacity and capabilities over the 3 decades. And when we talk about development assistance or development cooperation, we say we need to learn lessons from the advanced countries, which are often equivalent to European countries. So sometimes we go to Europe to have interviews and learn from them, but
접목할 수 있는지에 대해서
we also need to think about to what extent we can apply these lessons in the Korean context. And of course, such cooperation and exchanges are necessary, but we need to see whether we have been doing a good job in promoting actual cooperation.
개발협력 재원의 이슈가 있는데
And there's also an issue of funding. We always have lack of funding resources, so we need to attract foreign investment and private sector money for economic and developmental assistance. And we can use private sector money to provide funding to developing countries. And the European countries have such a mechanism in place already. So we can learn from Europe so that we can utilize private sector financial resources.
마지막으로 이제
And finally, I would like to comment on Professor Kim's presentation, which is about value-based economic cooperation partnership. And so the presentation was very detailed, but
뭐 고민을 했다는 말씀들을 하셨던 것 같은데
as he already mentioned, this is not an easy topic to discuss
경제 협력에 있어서 가치 중심
because
자주 들어본
value-based cooperation is a relatively a new concept when it comes to economic cooperation. So in conducting economic cooperation, how can it be value-based? Because when it's value-based, it's more of a political approach. And when the situations change, then this approach may not be applicable anymore. So when we say value, such value has to be sustainable and consistent. So we need to think about how to ensure consistency in our value-based approach. And as Professor Kim mentioned, he said whether it is value-based or based on national interest. Well, you may think that these are contradicting to each other, but we can pursue both of them in a harmony. If that can happen, it will be really nice. So thank you. Thank you, Professor Kim.
해주셨대요. 내용도 좋았지만요.
Thank you for keeping to the time constraint. I like the content as well. Kim Eun-kyung, please go ahead. I'm from Gyeonggi Research Institute. Thank you very much for your wonderful comments as well as the presentations.
좋은 얘기들을 빼고
So let's put that aside. And I want to, I actually thought about how I can contribute to the process. So at a very high level, at a macro level, we don't just use the term cooperation, we use the term economic cooperation because it leads to economic benefits. It comes from the wider framework of economy, so they actually have to be aligned with each other. So value orientation, value focus, that has to be seen from the economic cooperation point of view as well. So we're talking about two different types of cooperation. So areas of cooperation between the two sides, like ODA, the other speaker talked about exchanges and cooperation between the two regions. Professor Kim made the right comment about the ODA. And there's a history, background, purposes are all different, but Korea has a relatively short history in terms of ODA. So what are the common values that pull us together in terms of ODA?
첫 번째로 저는 아까 재원 문제에 대해서 우선
You talked about financial resources, lack of funding.
사실 ODA가
The commentator said, it seems that the ODA was quite of a popular notion. For example, local governments, they don't really have a lot of ODA funding, but they're trying to expand that. And the purpose is not really clear, so it's not really making any progress, but we can tap into that. What is really important is that, for example, we have lots of cooperation with other countries. They want to learn about two things. Other than economic cooperation, they want to look at urban planning, residential housing, and industrial cluster development.
클러스터의 역사가 가장 출발이 한 데가 바로 유럽 아니겠습니까?
And Europe has a very long history of building those clusters. So we can transfer our knowledge. And on top of that, economic cooperation will come in addition, but EU, Africa, for other developing countries, I think our two regions can work together to make some contribution in that regards.
자체 교류 협력에서는 지금
And in terms of just pure level exchanges and cooperation, we're a border country. So when it comes to North Korea issues,
EU의 역할이 굉장히
I think the EU can really play a significant role. We're talking about alliance with the United States, But especially when there's a stalemate, we can tap into different channels available to us, and we can utilize the relations with the EU, whether it is peace, human rights. We all pursue the same values. So I think because the United States has a more tolerant approach to North Korea, it could be a boon for us. Because I'm an expert in industrial policy, I think we've been talking about two major industry policies. One is digital, second is green transformation. The EU, as you may be well aware, is a regulatory region. So we talked about digital transformation, digital technology cooperation. We said that we have to promote that cooperation. That's all right in and of itself. And I was in the UK last month, and I've been going around, circling back to Europe, and they talk about digital because Korea is known as an IT powerhouse. But in order for us to do technological cooperation, our institutions have to be aligned. But they really focus on preemptive preemptive regulation in terms of the IPRs and so forth. So they are very stringent in terms of regulations. So that has to be harmonized. And regulatory cooperation between the two regions will become more important going forward. And the second factor is digital transformation, but taking a regulatory approach to that is going to be quite different. Now, it's a voluntary regulation, not a platform-based approach towards regulation with the new government. Now, platform companies in Korea are not really fully developed, so it may be right, but global MNCs, the platform companies, their sales activities has a lot of room for improvement because it was the biggest concern for the EU. That is why digital tax and various attempts were made. Of course, the OECD has a digital treaty that is going to go into effect. And not only the GDPR, but they have Digital Industry Act as well as Digital Service Act. The main target is for dealing with the global platform companies in terms of anti-competitive behavior and to protect consumers. So we can learn from Europe in that regard, learn about their examples. Many large platform companies in Korea, they talk about reverse discrimination. So we need some thoughts around that as well. Lastly, green transformation. Green itself is regulation from an industry point of view. And the EU talks about multilateralism, but it is actually doing it in a unilateral manner, historically speaking. So what would be the path forward for Korea in that regard? And as was mentioned by Professor Kim, it is more about not taking a preemptive approach, but taking a reactive approach. And CBAM as well, other areas of interest. And we need to take a better approach to responding this. There are various EU systems. For example, there is going to be a pilot project, and from 2025 there will be 9 different sectors that will be open. They are very much related to the Korea's key export items. And we need to come up with the right response to the market trends, which will be changed in 2025. And then we can cooperate. For example, how we're going to link that to the ETS in Europe and how Korea's ETS will have to be realigned. We can start from there. And then we'll have to come up with the right policies. But anyway, so it's all about developing the right response strategy and how to push forward with the green transformation. How can we apply that back to our green technologies? So we have to cooperate on the regulatory side as well as technology. And towards the end of the 2010s or so, whether it is private sector or public sector, the European companies, for example, had dramatic changes. And they have been doing that on a gradual basis, but we are trying to do it all of a sudden. So that is why we need to learn more from Europe. And I think there's a lot of room for cooperation between the two sides, and also to carry out some specific projects.
Thank you. We don't have much time, so I'm going to ask each presenter 1 minute to respond to these comments. So in the order of the presentation, first, researcher Kang Na-kyung. Okay, thank you for providing me with wonderful comments and things to think about. So, thank you.
해주신 것처럼
As you mentioned, the European Union has been a leader in digital transformation and they're leading in terms of regulation setting, but the European Union doesn't really have a platform to be a leader in that. So the social media platforms, they don't have their own social media platforms. They're using the American platforms. So as consumers, what is the role of the EU? This is something that we also need to consider at the same time. And as for Korea and its relations with the EU in the environmental area, we can think about our key industries such as steel industry, and we can work to prepare in advance for these industries to respond to these environmental regulations. Thank you. Next, Professor Lee.
예. 좋은 말씀 너무 감사합니다.
Thank you
특별히 이제 제가
for your comments,
관련해서
especially in relation to the presentation that I gave.
하지만 너무 좋은 말씀 해주셔서 감사드리고요.
Professor Kim gave me a very good point, especially in relation to the assessment of the OD capabilities of Korea and also for the funding.
유럽이 이제 특히 민간 재원을 바로 그 개도국
How the EU
지원하는 형태
is involving the private sector in providing such development assistance to developing countries. And I think we can learn from the European examples. So thank you.
잘하는 부분에서 이제
And of course, there are some areas of strength for us, urban planning development and industrial complex development.
좀 있는 것 같고요. 또 북한과 관련해서도
Gave us a lot of food for thought, and also for North Korea issues.
여러 가지 그런
The EU
그 경제개발 프로젝트들을 많이 하려고 했었기
was trying to carry out some economic cooperation projects with the regime, so I think we can utilize that
그런 내용들을 조금
toward our advantage.
정도에 담도록 하겠습니다.
And I will try to include that as part of my research going forward. Thank you, Dr. Kim.
Finally, Professor Kim, value-based is what I mentioned. It is about changing and reforming the supply chains. So in the process of restructuring the global supply chains, value has been emphasized. And we can use this process as a channel to create opportunities for us. How can we redistribute economic resources? How can we put economic resources, and in what areas, with what country, we're going to exchange goods and services and promote cooperation? So these are some of the key economic choices or strategic decisions and choices we need to make. And in the process of making choices, value base is going to be utilized. And as for AFT, I hope that Korea will be more active. So trade, aid for trade, so that we can help build capacity in the developing countries for trade. And finally, the European Union has its own integration aspect, but also each EU member state has its own sovereignty and own market and own policies. So we can also contact and work with individual EU member states as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Kim. That brings us to the end of the session. We won't be able to take any questions from the audience. So we're going to wrap up our session. Global Korea Forum 2022 EU session. We were able to look at the issues related to the value-based economic cooperation between Korea and Europe. I hope that the discussions today will go a long way towards further research and policy development going forward. Thank you very much, especially our speakers as well as our three panelists for taking the valuable time out of their busy schedules, especially given the fact that we're coming towards the end of the year. And also, we'd like to thank our online viewers, our participants once again. And that concludes the session for today. Thank you very much.